by the fact that as we were watching, particularly that lower right-hand quadrant, the House floor, that is the scene where just a few hours ago, more than a dozen members of Congress were sheltering on the floor under the desks and under the chairs in there while gunfire erupted through the door of the House chamber. A woman was shot and ultimately died from her wounds not far from there. Members of Congress were in gas masks as dispersant gas was applied by Capitol Hill police. They were sheltering from gunfire, members of Congress comforting one another while they're hiding for their lives. And now we're proceeding with these objections to the vote.
Yeah, you put your finger on what I'm finding difficult with at the moment. At one level, I understand, and I think it's admirable and correct and appropriate to proceed with business as usual to show that they are uncowed by the armed insurrectionists unleashed on the Capitol by the President of the United States, who has been plotting actively in public and in private sedition now for 8 weeks since he lost the presidential election, in order to not allow those people to cow them from doing their constitutional duty. Reasserting normalcy is all well and appropriate, but there is something, frankly, kind of appalling about the tone of normalcy that is resumed in the nation's capital on this evening, on a day in which we've seen the most severe threat to democratic sovereignty in the nation since the Civil War and the firing of the cannons in Fort Sumter. I mean, what happened today, which is being treated, I think, as some kind of unpleasant episode, which we should get past to get upon and back on the right track of the nation's peaceful transition of power, strikes me as flirting with ignoring what happened and the pressing emergency that faces the nation right now, which is that the President of the United States is clearly a danger and threat to the Republic and needs to be lawfully removed from office as fast as is legally practicable. To watch Ben Sasse speechify about shoveling your neighbor's snow, which is a good, nice thing to do, while the president retains control of the nuclear codes, having urged essentially his battalions of fascist thugs to storm the Capitol, is just very, very difficult to digest, I have to say.
And to your point, Chris, this is not something that, like, happened a while ago, even happened a few days ago. I mean, I still haven't totally digested the fact that we have the president on tape calling the Secretary of State in Georgia and saying, I need you to invent election results for me. That was like not that many hours ago. This just happened, and we've got this spin screen right now that we're watching that also includes the president's supporters having been pushed back from the building they stormed, leaving one woman dead in their wake, right? Almost no arrests after their actions today. Where are they right now? They're home, or they are elsewhere out in the streets. They're trading war stories, bragging about the violence and the vandalism that they got away with, the terror they brought to the U.S. government today, their success in temporarily halting the work of transferring power from their candidate to the one who just beat him in the last election, because they did stop that process for 5 hours. They walked away from the U.S. Capitol that they violently assaulted without consequences. Now the Congress is, going to put plywood on the windows and get back to doing its work belatedly to count the electoral votes and install a new president. Well, what's the current president doing? Presumably he's plotting his next attack.
Precisely. And we all know that. I mean, we have watched this from 2015. Every single thing that Lindsey Graham and Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz and Rick Perry and Mitt Romney said about the man them was true, and they knew it. And anyone who was too stupid to know it is too stupid for public life, that it would always end up here. Mitch McConnell said in May of 2016, he reassured Republicans that the man's temperament would be fine. And now the entire enterprise sits atop a mountain of corpses in the deadliest year in American history, as we have watched people storm the Capitol and attempt to stop the peaceful transfer of power, and the president sits in the White House at this moment as still the constitutional commander-in-chief of the nation's armed forces. I understand a desire not to run around with your hair on fire, but this is very clearly a national emergency that we find ourselves in, and it is slightly bizarre to watch the kind of decrepit proceduralism of the Congress at this moment when we are in said emergency.
And we are hearing, Chris, reports that there may be resignations, that some people are thinking about their future. To have had the only resignations in the wake of this act today be the White House Social Secretary, the First Lady's Chief of Staff, and a Deputy Press Secretary, to have that be it. I mean, we are advised, NBC is reporting that others at a higher level are considering it, but when Republicans went to Richard Nixon and said, listen, we caught you cheating and trying to cover up that crime and everybody's heard that tape, you got to go. think about the magnitude of that act by the president versus what we just had today from President Trump, and to have Republicans not asking for his resignation, other than the Republican governor of Vermont, to have Congress, Senator Hawley at least, not having his resignation demanded for having started this entire thing in the Congress, but him sticking with it, staying with this. I mean, the idea that the Republican Party is going to somehow defy the label of being a violent insurrectionist party with fascist markers is hard to see when their internal discipline is stern speeches and no rebukes.
And I have to say this, that relates to something that I have seen present today, which is that America has a story it tells itself about what kind of democracy it is. And that story, I think, is noble and in many parts true and important in urging us towards, as Lincoln said, the better angels. But there's another part of the story. There have been coups in American history. In 1898, a white supremacist coup took over the capital of Wilmington, North Carolina, because a fusionist white-black government won an election that they refused to allow to happen. And you know what? That coup was successful because they faced no recriminations, and it was part of a wave of coups that happened throughout the South to restore white supremacy in the South. We have had coups. We have had assaults and attacks on democracy, and we don't think of them or learn them as such because they worked. So the democracy we have is precious, and it doesn't assert itself simply by gestural rhetoric about our traditions and our specialness and our exceptionalness. It preserves itself through the righteous acts of those in power to preserve it. And I fear right now that we are at a precipice and a testing point that I hope those folks will meet over and above speeches.